Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
After serving time for his wife, the husband returned to his hometown. But upon arriving at the station, he froze when he saw his wife with her lover and decided to eavesdrop on their conversation. A car was speeding down an empty road. The driver was a young woman, but she drove like a real racer. In the passenger seat was her husband, who clung to the door handle and watched as the speedometer needle approached its maximum. "Adriana, why are you driving so fast?" he asked. "We're not on the highway. I want to get home quickly." "If someone hadn't spent 3 hours choosing a regular kettle, I wouldn't be rushing, and I have a TV series to watch," replied his wife. "That TV series is not worth our lives. Slow down. You shouldn't drive this fast in the city. And you're pregnant too," her husband said. "You're not thinking about the baby or yourself at all." Adriana eased up on the gas pedal, but she was still speeding. Her face showed complete dissatisfaction with how her husband was talking to her, but Bruno was just worried about her. It was a natural and understandable feeling. "I've been driving for 5 years," Adriana said indignantly. "I haven't had a single accident during that time, and you're nagging like an old lady." Before Bruno could respond, the brakes screeched, followed by a dull thud. Adriana froze in place, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. It seemed she didn't even blink. The girl was too scared to move. Bruno immediately got out of the car and ran to the victim. He realized in an instant that nothing could be done for the person and confidently returned to the car and opened the driver's door. "Is he alive?" "Bruno, did I kill him?" Adriana asked fearfully, not taking her eyes off the young man lying on the road. A dark puddle was forming under his head, spreading further. "Get out of the driver's seat," Bruno said. "Quickly, before anyone sees, get out." Adriana, not understanding anything, unbuckled her seatbelt and got out of the car. She approached the victim and turned away sharply, covering her eyes with her hands. The girl started crying and sat in the passenger seat. She sat there with her face covered and quietly whined. "I hit someone," Bruno said into the phone. "Yes, the address?" "There's no street here." He called an ambulance. When Adriana heard her husband's words, she realized he wanted to take the blame for her. She quickly removed her hands and looked at her husband as a loyal dog looks at its owner. "Why did you do that?" Adriana asked when Bruno returned to the car. Her voice trembled with fear. She wasn't speaking, she was whimpering, but very quietly. "Because that guy is definitely beyond saving," her husband replied. "It's better for me to go to prison than for my pregnant wife." Adriana sobbed bitterly, suddenly banging on the car. She hit the door, the glove compartment, and Adriana literally had a fit. "I don't understand where he came from. I didn't even see him get onto the road," she said. "I didn't see him either," her husband replied. "The guy brought this trouble upon himself. He wanted to cross the road at an unauthorized place. There are no pedestrian crossings here, and luckily, no cameras." "To prison, you say they'll put you in prison, but he ran out on his own," the girl lamented. "We should have just left. Why did we stop? Let's run away. You called an ambulance, we did everything we could." "I already said I hit someone." "They'll find me by the number," said Bruno. "They won't find you. They can't even find fraudsters," Adriana pleaded. "How will I be without you? And the baby?" "I don't work, Bruno." "You can't go to prison." Bruno didn't answer his wife. By now, both the police and the ambulance had arrived. They took quite a while to sort things out at the accident scene. No witnesses, no cameras, but Bruno admitted guilt, for which he was even praised. The police also noted that under these conditions, another driver might have simply fled the scene of the accident. Adriana couldn't stop looking at the body of the deceased, covered with a plastic bag. Now she would have to live with this. Exhausted, Adriana returned home alone. She spent the whole night crying into her pillow. As soon as she closed her eyes, the face of that young man appeared. Out of exhaustion, the girl dozed off, but a few minutes later, she woke up from a nightmare. She dreamed of the pedestrian. He was coming straight at her with a bloody face, telling her he had big plans for life, was studying at college, wanted to propose to his beloved, and was helping his sick mother. All of this was invented by Adriana's imagination. She knew nothing about the deceased boy. At 3 a.m, Adriana couldn't take it anymore and sent a message to a friend. She asked her to come over in the morning. She didn't want to be alone. She was tormented by her own thoughts. Somehow Adriana managed to get some sleep. She washed her face several times with cold water to wash away the unpleasant memories, but it didn't help. Still, as soon as she closed her eyes, the image of that boy appeared. She didn't eat breakfast. In her state, she couldn't swallow a bite. Finally, someone knocked at the door. Adriana ran to open it. She thought it was Carmelita. They had agreed to meet in the morning. Or rather, Adriana had asked her friend to come by. But it wasn't Carmelita. Standing at the door was her mother-in-law. "What happened yesterday?" the anxious woman asked immediately. Adriana began to tell the official version that Bruno had hit someone to death. The person had unexpectedly run out onto the road. Only Bruno and Adriana should know who was actually driving. Bruno himself had told his wife to stick to this version for everyone. "I don't believe it," Claudia Iglesias said. "How could Bruno not react? I've been in the car with him so many times, he's always so careful." "I'm telling you, that guy practically threw himself under the wheels," Adriana replied to her mother-in-law. "An investigation is underway. This might come to light. He ran out into the middle of the road. No one would have had time to react. Bruno is not at fault." This phrase echoed in Adriana's mind. It was true that Bruno wasn't to blame for what happened, but she was trying to convince herself that the young man had caused his own death. He's ruined himself and put others in trouble," Claudia Iglesias said, shaking her head. "And you've probably been nagging Bruno the whole way. I know you. You never keep your mouth shut. You distracted him with your chatter, and that's why he didn't see the pedestrian." Although Adriana knew she was at fault for what happened, her mother-in-law's version shocked her. Even in this situation, Claudia had managed to blame her. "I wonder who you would have blamed if I hadn't been in the car at that moment?" Adriana said resentfully, placing a plate of cookies in front of her mother-in-law to occupy her mouth and make her quiet down a bit. However, Claudia was not deterred and continued to speak with her mouth full. "Bruno has been in a bad state because of you. He's been so disoriented lately," she said, crumbs flying everywhere. Adriana was always irritated by this habit of her mother-in-law. Not to mention that Claudia Iglesias was not a pleasant person. Their relationship had been strained from the beginning. To her credit, Bruno had tried to keep his wife and mother from interacting too much. He even bought an apartment as far away from his mother's house as possible. Since Adriana and Claudia Iglesias rarely saw each other, their rare meetings were polite and based on mutual respect. But not this time. "You've become even more demanding with your pregnancy. He did everything for you," the mother-in-law continued. "If you've forgotten, I suggested getting rid of the baby. It was your Bruno who decided to give us a second chance." Adriana couldn't take it anymore and shouted at her mother-in-law. "If you were so worried about your son, you should have talked to him back then. I put my career on hold because of this pregnancy. I quit my job and became a housewife. Bruno offered me this himself and made all the decisions in our family, so it's foolish to blame me for ruining his mood." That's not true. Indeed, Adriana and Bruno's marriage had started to crack a year ago. They had lived happily for 3 years, but then realized that everyday life had pushed all the romance aside, and they couldn't get along in daily life. The girl herself suggested a divorce. Bruno didn't mind, but the process was constantly postponed, even though they had already been living more like neighbors than a married couple. In the end, when the decision to divorce was final and irreversible, and the date was set, Adriana found out she was pregnant. They missed that appointment. The couple discussed for a long time whether they could provide the love and care the baby needed. whether they would find a new breath for their life together. There was no mutual hatred or dislike, just that romance had faded and the relationship had become more friendly than romantic. So there was hope that it would work out. Adriana had indeed suggested resolving things more simply. No baby, no need to save the marriage. But Bruno was categorically against it. His wife told him that she didn't plan to become a single mother, so Bruno and Adriana gave their relationship a second chance. For a while, everything seemed to be fine. It seemed that feelings had indeed been revived. But when the third month of pregnancy arrived, everything reverted to the previous state. Adriana was unhappy with her husband's habits, and he was annoyed by her behavior. But Bruno could reassure himself that his wife's hormones were raging, making her excessively irritable. Adriana found no excuses for her husband. He simply annoyed her with his very presence in her life. But when Bruno decided to take the blame for her, when he showed he was willing to go to prison for her, Adriana realized she hadn't made a mistake with her choice of man. Only a loving person would take such a risk. As soon as she managed to awaken that love within herself, her mother-in-law came and destroyed it all. "You're as stubborn as your son," Adriana said with hatred. "Or rather, he inherited that trait from you. I don't want to talk to you or see you in my home." "This isn't even your house," Claudia Iglesias said and stood up. She brushed the crumbs off her skirt onto the floor, which infuriated Adriana even more. The girl couldn't stand disorder. She could vacuum and wash the floors twice a day. Her mother-in-law knew about this cleanliness obsession and did it on purpose. Claudia Iglesias opened the door and nearly knocked Carmelita over, who was just reaching for the handle. She decided to chat with a friend. She should have thought about her husband instead, the mother-in-law shouted from the hallway. Carmelita slammed the door right in her face. "Good for her. I'm fed up with her," Adriana praised her friend. Carmelita hadn't even taken off her shoes before she noticed that her friend was literally trembling. She hugged her and comforted her. "Tell me what happened," the friend said once they were in the kitchen. Adriana lied to her as well, saying that Bruno had hit someone and Claudia Iglesias had blamed her for everything. The girl told the story very emotionally and once again worked herself up into a frenzy. Tears rolled down her cheeks and her body shook all over. Suddenly, she clutched her stomach and then she saw Carmelita's astonished face. "I'm calling an ambulance," Carmelita managed to say. Adriana was immediately taken for examination. She was at risk of a miscarriage. She had been too stressed and had not been able to protect the baby. Carmelita waited for her friend in the emergency room, but was told she could leave. Adriana would stay at least a week because complications had arisen after the miscarriage. Why does she have to go through all this? Carmelita wondered anxiously. She found out when she could visit her friend and went home. She wrote to Adriana that she was told to leave. Adriana didn't reply. She had other things on her mind at the moment. Later in the evening, a detective came to question Adriana about the accident. He informed her that alcohol and a banned substance had been found in the deceased young man's blood. "We don't rule out that the young man intentionally ran into the road. He might not have even been aware of where he was or what was happening," the man explained. "Is this supposed to comfort me?" Adriana didn't understand. "Of course, because in that case, your husband might get a shorter sentence," the detective replied. Adriana would have preferred if Bruno didn't serve any time at all. He was innocent. She no longer considered herself at fault either. If the young man had stepped onto the road in an impaired state, then he was solely to blame for what happened. They could have been harmed too. If Adriana had noticed a pedestrian and tried to avoid the collision, there was no guarantee she would have been able to control the car. "That's good. Please tell him that I'm in the hospital. Let him know that I had a miscarriage after his mother's visit," Adriana asked. She repeated that it should be emphasized that Claudia Iglesias was to blame for what happened. Due to her hospitalization, Adriana couldn't attend the court, but Carmelita went in her place. After the discharge, the friends met, and Carmelita told her that the court was on Bruno's side. Even the accusing party did not press too hard. There was the mother of that young man, and I think she even felt a bit relieved, Carmelita said. That young man was a real burden to her. He was an alcoholic. You have no idea how many times he appeared in my dreams, talking about his plans, wedding, college, his sick mother needing help. Adriana shared her distress. Rest assured, that person definitely had no such plans, her friend replied. I hope this eases your conscience a little. Although I don't understand why you're torturing yourself. Bruno was the one driving. Adriana blushed and looked away. Her husband was sentenced to 7 years for a crime he did not commit. The lawyer assured her that Bruno would receive a maximum of 5 years, given the state of the deceased, but the court decided otherwise. Don't worry. Time will pass quickly, Carmelita tried to comfort her friend. I'll always be here. I won't let you fall into depression. What if I don't want to wait for him at all? Adriana suddenly said. You know our relationship was hanging by a thread, and 7 years at my age is a long time. Imagine, I'll be 27 now, and when Bruno gets out, I'll be 34. And he'll come back a different person. What if I find I don't want to be with him? In these 7 years, I could meet someone new, have a child. Can you imagine, if it weren't for the miscarriage, Bruno would have gotten out just when our child would be starting school. Carmelita thought her friend was just panicking, which is why she was speaking like this. She asked her to calm down and think about everything with a clear mind. You're going to regret making rash decisions, she said. Hang in there a bit longer, then you can think things through. Just imagine Bruno's situation. First, he goes to prison, and then you're saying you want a divorce. And when do I think about myself? Adriana asked. The friend sat in silence until Adriana received a call. It was Bruno's lawyer. He said that Adriana had the opportunity to meet her husband before he went to prison. The man insisted that it was crucial to find time for the meeting because Bruno had an important message for her. Adriana replied that she would come regardless. Just don't tell him you don't plan to wait for him. I beg you, Carmelita said as she said goodbye and went home. Adriana hadn't planned to tell Bruno her thoughts immediately. She knew he had taken the blame on himself. But she didn't know how to proceed. On one hand, she didn't want to betray her husband. On the other hand, she didn't want to waste precious time. The next day, Bruno was being transferred to prison. Adriana got up early to go to the store and prepare a package for him. The guards thoroughly examined her bags, discarding some items and allowing others. Adriana entered the visiting room with trembling legs. She couldn't hold back her tears, but Bruno maintained his composure. Why did they give you 7 years? Adriana asked despondently as she sat down in front of her husband. The lawyer promised no more than 5. Because it's considered manslaughter, and no one cares that the guy walked into the road himself, Bruno replied. But I was told that I might be eligible for parole if I behave well. I'll apply in about 3 years. But I didn't call you here just for that. Adriana listened carefully to Bruno's further words. Her husband had a small business. He wasn't a millionaire, but he had a steady, good income. Bruno was in the furniture manufacturing business. He had started his business just over a year ago, so he was still building his reputation and finding clients. In short, he was just getting started. He didn't want to lose his business, so he proposed that Adriana take his place. You'll be the temporary director, he said. But I don't know anything about this. How am I supposed to manage your business? Adriana was scared. You don't need to know much, Bruno reassured her. You'll be signing papers and holding meetings. You'll have my assistant, Constantino. He'll get you up to speed, explain strategies, and details. You don't need to worry about anything with him around. Adriana immediately reconsidered bringing up the divorce. She was already having doubts, but now she was sure it wasn't the right time. If she declared her intention to end the relationship, Bruno would appoint someone else to manage his company. And why would she want that? Adriana quickly devised a strategy. She didn't need to go to work now. She would receive almost passive income from her husband's company while others worked. In the 7 years Bruno would spend behind bars, she could save a substantial amount for a comfortable independent life without him. The girl returned home with mixed emotions. She felt both sad and happy. It was unpleasant to realize that Bruno would serve time for her, but no one had asked him to take on this burden. He did it all on his own, without consulting her, and her desire to save money wasn't betrayal. She wasn't going to steal. Adriana would earn. And maybe she could even develop the company further. Perhaps she would make things even better for Bruno. With this renewed motivation, Adriana went to meet Constantino the next day. The man was friendly and polite. He explained everything simply, without complex jargon. They began interacting as if they had known each other for years. "I suggest we celebrate our acquaintance at a restaurant," Constantino said as their business meeting came to an end. "I don't mind," Adriana replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I haven't been to a restaurant in ages." The girl was clearly flirting. Constantino seemed like a charming young man to her. He also kept the conversation light, not the kind expected between a boss and an employee. A month had passed since Bruno had been in prison. It was a tough time. He couldn't get used to life behind bars, but there was one piece of good news that lifted his spirits. He learned that once a month, his wife could visit him. The journey to the prison took about 10 hours. He thought it wasn't such a big sacrifice to meet his loved one. When the visiting day came, no one came to see him. Bruno thought that Adriana simply didn't know she could visit him. He decided to write her a letter, asking her to come next month. "I'll live only for this meeting," Adriana read the last lines of the letter. "We should probably go," Constantino suggested. "That would be nice." "You can tell him how well we're doing," Constantino replied. "Do I have to tell him everything about our affairs?" Adriana laughed and winked at her assistant. In the 30 days that Constantino and Adriana had worked together, their relationship took on a different character. They were more than just colleagues now. Once, after a successful deal, they woke up in the same bed. Despite the fact that Adriana had cheated on her husband in the first month of his imprisonment, she was indeed managing the business well. She had a lot to tell Bruno. She decided she would go to the visit. It wouldn't be right to abandon her husband so abruptly. Another month passed, and once again, only Bruno was left without visitors. He wrote another letter to his wife, asking her to at least respond. In these 2 months, Adriana hadn't written him a single letter. Bruno worried that the letters might not be reaching her. He had sent about 10 letters during his imprisonment. Adriana came home, holding the latest envelope. She walked into the bedroom, where Constantino was lying half-naked in bed. "I completely forgot I was supposed to visit the prison last week," she said with no regret. "He wrote me another long poem." The girl crumpled the letter and carried it to the trash can without even reading it. "I think you're making a mistake by ignoring Bruno so quickly," Constantino shouted, causing Adriana to stop. "He'll wait a year, maybe 2, and then he'll decide you've abandoned him and will file for divorce himself." "Is that possible from prison?" Adriana asked in surprise. "I don't know about divorce, but appointing someone else as director of the company instead of you is very real," Constantino replied. "You're right, I need to write a letter," Adriana said after a moment's thought. "I'll lie that some unforeseen circumstance occurred, that there were no train tickets, and I'll buy the next ones today. I can't let him suspect anything." When Adriana read her husband's letter, her conscience stirred deep down. Bruno was so sincerely concerned about her, afraid that his letters weren't reaching her. He begged for some sign that she hadn't forgotten him, that she read all his tearful letters. Adriana wrote a reply immediately, promising that they would meet in a month. Bruno kept her response letter under his pillow for the entire month. He lived in anticipation of that meeting. The atmosphere in the prison was frightening. Adriana shuddered at the thought of spending a whole 7 years in such a place. She hadn't really thought about Bruno's feelings. When she saw him, her heart didn't flutter. He was a complete stranger to her. But she played the part of the caring wife very skillfully. Bruno had no idea that all this time his wife's heart was occupied by another man. They had only 1 hour. In those 60 minutes, they needed to discuss many things. As the visit time was approaching its end, Adriana suddenly remembered the most important thing she wanted to ask from the very beginning. "You know, it's actually quite inconvenient that I'm just an acting director," the girl hinted. "There's no real trust in me. Many deals have fallen through because of it." Bruno immediately understood what his wife was hinting at, and he didn't like it at all. "It's not a big deal," he replied to Adriana. "If they don't trust you, then there's no point in working with them. We know people like that. They're just looking for an excuse to back out." Adriana frowned. But that's all right, she would try another approach next time. Bruno spent a lot of time wondering if he had made a mistake in trusting his wife with the business. Initially, he had considered who would be the best person to manage his business. He didn't want to give the company to a stranger, even if it was an assistant, because Constantino might deceive him. Not because Constantino had a bad reputation, no. You could expect betrayal from anyone. After all, in 7 years, a person could quickly get used to a good life. That's why Bruno chose Adriana. He thought his wife wouldn't harm him, especially considering he was behind bars because he was trying to help her. But now he wasn't so sure. Constantino arrived with Adriana, but he deliberately stayed away from the prison so that Bruno wouldn't find out he was with Adriana. "How did it go?" the man asked when Adriana approached him. "Not well. He didn't agree to transfer the business to me," the girl replied. "But that's not surprising. We started trying too soon. And I told you not to ignore his letters," Constantino reminded her. "How can he trust you if you don't reply to his letters and came to the visit only once and immediately demanded that he transfer the company to you?" The first year of Bruno's imprisonment was coming to an end. Adriana no longer ignored the visits, but she responded to letters sporadically. She didn't bring up the business transfer anymore, but not because she had changed her mind. She simply wanted to gain Bruno's trust, to give him hope that she wasn't planning to deceive him. She and Constantino were trying to come up with deceptive ways to take over the business, but nothing had come to mind yet. Adriana and Bruno had moved in together. They had almost stopped hiding their relationship. The only person who couldn't find out about their affair was Claudia Iglesias. But she conveniently went to the countryside after her son was imprisoned. It was her way of distracting herself from the depression caused by her son's incarceration. The woman immersed herself in household chores, worked in the garden, and restored her grandmother's house. In short, she had plenty of tasks to keep her busy. Unlike Adriana, Claudia Iglesias wrote letters to her son constantly. At first, Bruno hadn't told his mother about his relationship with Adriana. But after she started forgetting about him more often and hinted again at the last visit that she wanted to become the full owner of the business, Bruno asked his mother to check on his wife. He suspected that she might be involved with another man. She arrived at the visits looking too happy and attractive. No, Bruno didn't think Adriana should have given up on her appearance after his imprisonment, but she had put so much effort into her looks that she either appeared as a free woman open to new relationships or as someone already in love. Bruno literally had to swallow his pride when he asked his mother for this favor because he knew she would start lecturing and lamenting. That was the mood evident in her last letter. Claudia Iglesias acted like a dog that had been told to fetch. With great pleasure, she packed up and went to see her daughter-in-law without warning. She had the keys to her son's apartment, so she purposely went in the morning, assuming Adriana would be at work. Claudia wanted to check the apartment first. She was sure she could find evidence of a man's presence in the home. Constantino and Adriana were their own bosses, so they weren't in a hurry to get up in the morning. The couple was enjoying their time in bed when they heard someone jingling keys outside the door. Both jumped up immediately. They were lucky that they weren't asleep yet and that Claudia kept all the keys on one ring. There were at least 10 of them. While she was looking for the right one, Adriana managed to rush to the door and lock it with the top lock. It could only be opened from the inside. They usually locked it at night, but this time they had forgotten. When Adriana looked through the peephole, her heart sank. She whispered to Constantino to hide. "Hide where?" he asked. "Anywhere, just make sure she doesn't see you." "Claudia will definitely search every corner," Adriana replied and looked through the peephole again. It seemed Claudia heard some noise inside and pressed her ear to the door. Adriana quickly began to turn the handle to make it look like she was trying to open the door. "Claudia Iglesias, the lock seems to be stuck," Adriana shouted. "Did you put the key in the lock?" "No, I haven't even found it yet," replied the mother-in-law. Adriana pretended to be busy trying to fix the lock and open the door while Constantino gathered his things and put everything in the closet. As soon as he disappeared behind the door, Adriana turned the top lock and let Claudia in. "Did you keep me waiting on purpose?" asked the suspicious woman, who immediately cast a wary glance around the hallway and corridor. She even sniffed the air to catch any unusual scents. "Don't be silly," Adriana replied, trying to appear carefree while she was actually quite anxious. "I'm frightened myself. I have an important meeting today." "So, you are lying in bed at 9 in the morning?" Claudia Iglesias laughed at her. "I need to use the bathroom after my trip. Put the kettle on, and then we'll talk." Adriana tensed even more. They hadn't had time to clean the bathroom, and there was a trash can where she had just thrown away a letter from Bruno yesterday. But she hoped her mother-in-law hadn't lost her mind to the point of rummaging through the trash. Adriana went to set the kettle on while she mentally checked if there was anything in the bathroom that could compromise her and Constantino. A few minutes later, she entered the kitchen. She was pale, almost green. Adriana was first frightened by the color of her mother-in-law's face, and then she noticed that she was holding a letter. The woman hadn't hesitated to dig through the trash can. Adriana was terrified that the letter contained Bruno's veiled regret about taking the blame for someone else. Specifically, he complained that he was so miserable that he sometimes regretted his decision. "Is Bruno innocent?" Claudia asked barely audibly. "He didn't hit that guy? Please sit down and drink some water. You look so unwell." "I'm worried," Adriana asked anxiously and turned to find a glass and pour some water. "But there was no one else in the car with him except you," Claudia continued, ignoring her daughter-in-law. "Did he stand up for you?" Adriana frantically searched for dishes. Where had all her cups and mugs suddenly disappeared to? Suddenly, she heard a dull sound behind her. The girl froze and was afraid to turn around. "Adriana, what are you standing there for? Call an ambulance!" Constantino shouted, already standing in the doorway. The girl didn't understand anything. Why had her lover run out in his underwear if her mother-in-law was clearly there for an inspection? And why was Claudia silent? And what was that sound? Adriana was so frightened that she couldn't piece together the facts and draw conclusions. Constantino saw that his beloved was in a stupor. Adriana remained frozen with her arm extended, holding the cupboard door. He waved his hand and ran to get the phone himself. Once again, Adriana saw a person's body being covered with a sheet. She sat in the kitchen, staring at one point, completely at a loss for how to tell Bruno what had happened, and how to avoid suspicion that she was responsible for his mother's death. Although, it couldn't be said that Adriana was directly to blame. The girl decided that at least in this situation, she wouldn't lie to Bruno and would tell him that Claudia's heart stopped after reading the letter from her son to his wife. She just left out the part that the letter had been retrieved from the trash can by her mother-in-law. Constantino didn't attend the funeral. He said he would go home instead to collect some things. He was now living with Adriana but hadn't completely moved in. Sometimes he visited his home for necessary items. In his mailbox, Constantino also found a letter. Naturally, no one but Bruno could have written to Constantino. His friend and boss asked Constantino to keep an eye on Adriana. He suspected that his wife was hiding something. He warned that he needed to be cautious about her work matters. She might be preparing some kind of setup. I will keep an eye on her. Don't worry, my friend, Constantino replied aloud, taking a sheet of paper and a pen. The man hurried to write a reply because, unlike Adriana, it was important to create the impression that he didn't disregard Bruno. It was due to her attitude that Adriana had come under suspicion. First, her mother-in-law was sent to check on her, then an assistant. If things continued like this, someone might start watching Constantino as well. The man couldn't allow that, so he immediately began writing a response letter. Carmelita knew that her friend had started a relationship with another person, but she didn't expect that they had also planned to take over Bruno's business. Although Adriana had immediately told her friend that she wasn't planning to wait for her husband, Carmelita still felt sorry for him. They rarely communicated, mostly during holidays when Adriana invited all her friends. Carmelita wasn't close to Bruno, but she felt sorry for him as a person. The friend decided to talk to Adriana and give her some advice. "I see you're glowing with happiness," Carmelita complimented Adriana. "It's obvious you're in love." "I know you're going to start lecturing me now," Adriana's friend rolled her eyes and replied. "But I'm telling you straight away that I don't feel guilty. Bruno will be in prison for another 6 years, and my best years are passing by. I'm not judging you, and I don't dispute that you're a remarkable woman and want happiness. But how did Bruno react to your new relationship?" Carmelita asked. Adriana blushed and said that she hadn't confessed anything to Bruno. Carmelita's eyes widened, and she immediately said that it was wrong. "He'll find out sooner or later," Carmelita said. "It's impossible to hide it for 6 years. If you decide to get married again or get pregnant, how will you explain it to Bruno?" Adriana thought and said she wasn't planning to get married again, and she could lie about being pregnant. Carmelita was even more surprised and a bit angry. "Why are you worried about your years then?" she asked. "Why rush to move in together if you're not planning anything serious?" Adriana was at a loss. This time she didn't know what to say. She couldn't tell her friend that she wasn't discussing a divorce with Bruno because she hoped to take over his business. The girl decided it was better to lie and say she had talked everything over with her husband rather than come up with excuses. "I'll write him a letter today," Adriana promised. Carmelita calmed down and changed the subject of the conversation. Soon, she noticed that her friend wasn't very interested in continuing the conversation. Besides, Constantino had come home, and Carmelita definitely didn't want to run into him, so she hurried to leave. When Carmelita went downstairs, she saw the postwoman. The woman was standing by Adriana's mailbox and looking at it in confusion. "Do you know if anyone lives in apartment 32? She asked Carmelita. "Yes, I live there," the girl lied for some reason. "What's the matter?" "The matter is that I have no more room to put the letters," the postwoman said indignantly. But when she saw Carmelita's bewildered yet kind expression, she softened a bit. "I've been putting letters here for about 3 months. Why haven't you taken them out?" The postwoman handed Carmelita the letter and asked her once again to clear out the box. The woman was about to leave, but Carmelita stopped her. "Sorry. I was away and didn't collect the mail, but I have another problem." Carmelita spoke uncertainly because she wasn't good at lying, but the postwoman believed her. "I lost the key to the box. Can you tell me how to open it?" "As far as I know, these locks have the simplest mechanism. You can open it with a regular knife," the woman advised. Carmelita thanked her and started thinking if she had something like a knife. She emptied her bag onto the windowsill. Of course, she didn't have a knife, but she did have the keys to her own mailbox. Why not, the girl thought, and went to the mailbox. A few confident movements and the lock clicked open. Carmelita quietly clapped her hands, quickly pulled out all the letters, found a couple of advertisements among them, put them back in the box, and easily locked it again. Carmelita's heart raced as if she had stolen something incredibly valuable rather than just letters. She had an interesting evening ahead. To her surprise, she noticed that some of the letters had been in the mailbox for several months. And she hasn't read any of these during all this time, the girl wondered. The first letter from Bruno brought her to tears. In it, the man spoke about his feelings over his mother's death. He blamed himself for her death, which was strange. That's how Carmelita learned that Bruno was in prison instead of Adriana. And knowing this, she started a relationship with his subordinate. Carmelita couldn't contain her emotions. The girl read the letter several times. Bruno couldn't directly say that it was Adriana who hit the person. All letters were reviewed by prison guards before being sent. Carmelita tried to understand if she had correctly interpreted Bruno's metaphors and the hidden meaning of his words. But after the second letter, she was convinced she was right. In the next letter, Bruno was in a completely different mood. He cursed Adriana for abandoning him, not responding to letters, and not visiting. Carmelita wiped her tears again. Another letter was another confession. Bruno apologized for insulting his wife in the previous message. One thing Carmelita understood for sure was that the man was suffering, and Adriana was the cause. The girl didn't reply to him, so he didn't know whether he was being ignored or if the guards simply weren't delivering the letters. Bruno asked for some kind of sign. Carmelita didn't know what to do. On one hand, her childhood friend, whom she couldn't betray. But on the other hand, she couldn't just watch Adriana turn into a real shrew. She wasn't particularly close to Bruno. They were more like acquaintances who only greeted each other during chance meetings and politely asked how things were. But the girl read such pain in Bruno's letters. The man was literally going insane from not understanding what was happening to him. He both regretted deciding to take the blame and scolded himself for these thoughts, confessed his love, and tore his soul apart with hatred. No, Carmelita said firmly to herself. I can't just remain silent. While Bruno can't make sense of himself and suffers from confusion, Adriana is sharing a bed with his employee. The girl tore a sheet of paper from the first notebook she could find and started writing. Her text was emotional. In some places, the ink smudged because tears dripped from her eyes. Carmelita wrote that Adriana was receiving the letters but leaving them in the mailbox. She apologized for daring to read such personal, even intimate texts. Carmelita was starting to formulate a sentence in which she planned to mention the lover. She tried to choose her words in various ways so they wouldn't hurt Bruno too much, but she realized it was impossible. You couldn't tell someone about infidelity without breaking their heart. How would Bruno feel when he learned that Adriana was living with another man in his own apartment and he wouldn't be free for another 6 years? The girl crumpled the completed letter and decided to completely redo it. In the second version, she wrote that Adriana wasn't collecting the letters from the mailbox but avoided any harsh insults toward her. She wrote the same thing, but much more gently. I knew she wouldn't wait for me, but I didn't think it would happen so soon, Bruno said when he read Carmelita's letter. Just file for divorce. Let him go free. And you can find someone else, suggested Bruno's cellmate. You don't understand, Diego. It's more complicated, Bruno replied thoughtfully. She's not just a wife, she's also managing my business. I can't just file for divorce and abandon my work. Otherwise, she'll just take everything over. If I can't trust the closest person to me, then I can't trust any of my subordinates. Carmelita was right not to tell Bruno about his wife's infidelity. Even the news that Adriana was deliberately ignoring his letters had caused him great emotional pain. She learned this from Bruno's reply. Bruno decided to respond to Carmelita. It was nice for him to have someone to communicate with. Previously, this need was fulfilled by letters with his mother, but now she was gone. Constantino sometimes replied to Bruno, but recently he hadn't been doing so often. Fortunately, Bruno didn't yet know the reason for the assistant's neglect. The thing was that Constantino was living with Adriana. When he came home, he read his friend and boss's letters and then responded. Almost all of Constantino's necessary belongings had already been moved to Adriana's place, so he rarely went home. Carmelita became the only person who regularly not only read Bruno's letters but also replied to each one. The girl decided that she would punish Adriana. A woman who put her husband behind bars should not now enjoy the company of another man, especially while plotting to enrich herself at her husband's expense. Carmelita couldn't influence Adriana in any way other than by applying moral pressure. Adriana returned home in a great mood. Today she had managed to close a successful deal with a good profit for herself. She climbed to her floor and immediately felt that something was wrong. On the last steps, there were some red drops that looked like blood. Perhaps one of the neighbors had bought a piece of fresh meat and it leaked through the bag. But no, the drops ended right at their door. Constantino couldn't have bought meat. They had planned to either order dinner from a restaurant or go to a cafe in the evening. But he might have changed his mind. Adriana looked up and saw that someone had shoved a note into the door frame, and it also had bloody marks on it. "You should be in prison," was written on the piece of paper. Adriana felt a shiver run down her spine. Only 4 people knew that she was driving during the accident: herself, Bruno, Constantino, and Bruno's mother. None of these people could have left a message for her. The only logical explanation she could find was that Bruno had managed to arrange for someone to terrorize her from prison, but it seemed unlikely. Adriana decided to leave everything as it was for now and not tell Constantino about what had happened. However, when he came home, the girl was very frightened and even screamed. The next day, Adriana opened the door and found another bloodstained note at her feet. "Bruno is innocent," it read. "Constantino, did you decide to play a prank on me?" asked Adriana, both irritated and scared. Constantino asked what the girl meant. Adriana didn't reveal the contents of the notes, just mentioned that someone had once again slipped her suspicious letters. "How could I have slipped a note into the door frame while being in the apartment?" Constantino asked logically. Adriana agreed that he couldn't have done that. But who else was leaving her these messages? The only remaining option was that Bruno had arranged for her to be harassed. But why and how could he have organized it? Although he had reasons, Adriana had been ignoring his letters. She suddenly ran out of the car and rushed to the mailbox. Adriana returned, pale with fear. Constantino hurried to find out what happened. "Did you take Bruno's letters?" she asked without any emotion. "No, I only read what he writes to me." "Although I haven't replied to him for a while," the man recalled. "It can't be that he hasn't written to me all this time," Adriana said. "There isn't a single envelope in the box." "Actually, it can be." Constantino tried to support Adriana's view of Bruno. "You're not writing, so he decided to leave you alone." "Why did you even remember this?" The girl told him about the 2 notes she received yesterday and today. Then she asked if Bruno could have done this. "In theory, he could have found someone on the outside and asked them to scare you," Bruno mused. "But who could he have written to besides me? By the way, he doesn't know that I'm aware of your story. I don't think he would have told anyone else if he didn't tell me. Maybe someone is just messing with you. They don't know the truth but want to confuse you. We have a lot of work ahead, and if you're distracted by your problems instead of focusing on your work, it benefits your competitors." Adriana calmed down a little. But by evening, she was in a new panic. She decided that someone had stolen Bruno's letters and now knew that her husband was imprisoned unjustly. "But he didn't tell you this in his letter," Constantino laughed. "That's exactly what he wrote in the message after which Claudia Iglesias had a heart attack," Adriana replied. "Of course, he never said it directly, but if my mother-in-law understood it, then someone else might have guessed." "Stop. That's nonsense." Constantino waved his hand and turned toward the house. "Who would think of robbing a mailbox? What can you even hope to steal from there?" Just as Adriana calmed down and stopped overthinking, she noticed huge red letters on the pavement under her windows. She immediately asked Constantino to stop the car and ran into the building. Constantino didn't understand what was happening, and a moment later, he saw Adriana's eyes at the window, filled with terror and tears. The man hurried to her. Adriana didn't answer any of his questions, she just pointed to the writing on the pavement. "It should be you in prison," was written on the asphalt. "Don't worry. This person made a mistake," Constantino reassured Adriana. "There are cameras at the entrance. We'll find this prankster." The couple immediately ran to the concierge to ask to see the footage from the cameras. "Call the police, and then I'll show you the recording," the elderly woman replied. Adriana was horrified. Calling the police for this case was definitely not advisable. It could bring more problems than help. The girl fell into a panic. She would never find out who was tormenting her so cruelly. Constantino continued to calm her. He pulled out a banknote from his wallet and politely asked the old woman to skip involving the police. Of course, the concierge was happy to accept the extra money. She quickly took the cash and found the relevant moment in the footage. But the presence of the cameras didn't help Adriana and Constantino much in finding the culprit. Yes, it was visible that the person came to the entrance about 40 minutes after they had left. The stranger was seen making the inscription, but the person was dressed in a black suit, hood, and black glasses. It was even impossible to determine the person's gender. However, both Adriana and Constantino agreed that it looked more like a woman. The figure was too slender. In short, the camera footage did not help Adriana understand who was leaving her terrifying messages. Constantino had wasted his money. Adriana had a severe headache. She lay down, almost powerless. Her phone rang. The girl immediately flinched. She was afraid it might be another scheme from her tormentor, but it was Carmelita calling. They hadn't been in touch for a while. Adriana answered, hoping it would distract her. Carmelita immediately asked about how Adriana was doing and the latest events. Adriana told her that someone was tormenting her. Of course, she didn't mention the reason for the harassment or the contents of the notes. Carmelita was a little pleased that she had managed to make her friend anxious. "I think I'm going crazy," Adriana complained. "I decided to install a camera in the building. Next time, I'll catch this prankster." Carmelita immediately noted that her call was not in vain because the next morning she was planning to slip Adriana another note. "Hang in there," Carmelita said in farewell. "If it gets too hard, call me." Unexpectedly for Adriana, all the harassment and notes stopped. She didn't even think to piece together the facts and realized that her friend was the tormentor. Nevertheless, she still looked at passers-by, trying to find a silhouette similar to the one she had seen in the security camera footage at the entrance. About 2 weeks after the lull, Adriana met on the street the mother of the young man who ended up under the wheels of her car. For some reason, she thought that it was she who had written the message on the asphalt. Adriana shook with anger. She ran up to the woman, grabbed her by the jacket, and shouted, "Why did you do this?" The woman was so frightened that she couldn't say a word. She turned pale and didn't understand what this stranger wanted from her. "The wallet is in the bag. You can take it," the woman said with a trembling voice. "I don't want your money. Just tell me why you harassed me," Adriana demanded an answer. But the woman didn't even know who was standing in front of her. Adriana hadn't been at the court hearing. The girl had found this mother on social networks herself. There was a time when her conscience troubled her, and she wanted to see the person whose child had died under the wheels of her car. "Miss, I don't understand what you're talking about. What harassment could I have carried out?" the woman said plaintively. "I've never seen you before." It dawned on Adriana that this was indeed the case. The mother of the deceased young man couldn't have sent her the notes. She didn't even know what she looked like. The girl said she had made a mistake and repeatedly apologized. A few more days passed as she continued to look around, and then she forgot about the strange messages. They ended as suddenly as they had begun. 5 years had passed since Bruno's imprisonment. Adriana occasionally wrote to and even visited her husband. Bruno didn't tell her that he knew about her deliberate ignoring of his letters. He was no longer as interested in Adriana as he was in her friend. The only regret Bruno had was that he couldn't invite Carmelita for a visit. Only a wife had the right to visit him. Carmelita also suffered from not being able to meet with Bruno. She was both upset for him and eager to talk face to face. The girl felt that their relationship was becoming romantic, and she couldn't wait to see Bruno in person and finally discuss what status their communication would continue in. Carmelita wasn't sure if she and Bruno had fallen in love. They had never discussed it, but she had immediately added all other suitors to her blacklist and refused to meet anyone. In the last year, Adriana had come only once before Christmas, so the girl didn't know that Bruno had tried to get an early conditional release. The man hadn't planned to pass this information to his wife and had asked his lawyer not to tell her. Let it be a surprise, whether pleasant or not, that was for Adriana to decide. This was the second attempt. The first time he was refused. Constantino knew about the first attempt. He told Adriana about it. "We need to resolve this issue quickly," he said. "Bruno is planning to try for parole again. And that means our sweet life might come to an end." "You said yourself that he doesn't trust me," Adriana replied. "He won't transfer the business to me, especially if he's getting out soon." "Why would he do that?" "Then we need to make sure he doesn't get out," Constantino mused. "There's actually one option." Adriana was so obsessed with money that she couldn't even entertain the thought of giving up the business. She already considered it hers. Despite her love for the luxurious life, she didn't want to work. She was willing to do anything to keep things as they were. She enjoyed living with Constantino and receiving almost passive income. All she needed for happiness was to become the rightful owner of Bruno's company. Initially, Adriana only wanted to accumulate funds by taking a portion of the profits for herself. She did just that, and a decent amount had accumulated in her account. But now she didn't want just a part, Adriana wanted everything. A week later, Adriana and Constantino were already heading to the train station. The girl was very anxious about her lover, as he was about to undertake a very important task. They had decided to ensure that Bruno not only didn't get out on parole, but stayed in prison for another 5 years. They figured that in this case, he would definitely agree to transfer the company to his wife. "I'm so scared." "How will you deal with these people?" Adriana said. "Don't worry. I'm not going to approach the prisoners directly," Constantino reassured her. The couple was approaching the platform. The train Constantino was supposed to take was arriving in half an hour. They had arrived too early due to their anxiety. Adriana suggested sitting on a bench to avoid getting lost in the crowd. Just then, another train arrived, and people from it surged onto the platform. "Wait, you said you wouldn't be dealing with prisoners?" Adriana suddenly remembered. "How will you persuade your acquaintance to set up Bruno?" "Oh, come on. All of this is done through the guards," Constantino replied. "What do you take me for?" "The only prisoner I know is your husband. I've made arrangements with a guard. He's my classmate. He'll pick a prisoner who has nothing to lose. Maybe we should make sure it's a sure thing?" Adriana pondered. Her eyes lit up with the realization of her brilliant idea. The girl thought that if there were prisoners who had nothing to lose and extending their sentence would actually be a benefit, she could convince one of them to stab Bruno. She had seen this in movies. If Bruno were gone, the problems would disappear. Think about it, Bruno might not only refuse to give me the company. He might even file for divorce. "I've completely forgotten about him lately," Adriana said. "So, if there's no person, there's no problem." "You've really become quite ruthless," Constantino laughed. "I'll ask Eduardo if this can be arranged." Of course, it would simplify things a lot. If Adriana hadn't forgotten about her husband, as she herself said, she would have known that their plan was doomed to fail. Moreover, Constantino had missed the last letter from his contact. He had stopped by home just before preparing for the trip. But he was in such a hurry that he didn't check the mailbox. If he had, he would have known that Bruno's parole hearing had already taken place, and he had been granted early release. What's more, Bruno had arrived home on the very train that stopped at the platform just as Adriana and Constantino entered the station. Only Carmelita knew that Bruno had been released from prison. She was waiting for him in the station parking lot. The girl had volunteered to meet him. Carmelita had fallen in love with Bruno through their correspondence, but didn't know if her feelings were reciprocated. She wanted to be there when the man came home and found that his wife was already with someone else. The girl hoped to offer Bruno support and thus get closer to him. But she didn't need to. Carmelita had become Bruno's closest person, and he also understood that when he returned home, he would have a serious conversation with Adriana about divorce. He realized that he couldn't be with her. But fate had something even more interesting in store for Bruno. He was walking past Adriana and Constantino when they were heading to the bench. The couple didn't notice him in the crowd. Bruno didn't rush to them with open arms. He quietly followed his wife and her companion and sat down right behind their bench to eavesdrop on their conversation. Bruno didn't understand why the two had come to the station. He assumed that Constantino was dealing with his wife only on business matters, but here he saw a lovely, affectionate couple. Even more intriguing was their conversation. Bruno heard everything from the beginning. He made a great effort not to reveal himself and confront Constantino directly. Bruno decided to take his revenge the same way his wife and lover did, sneakily. Carmelita was starting to get nervous. She knew that Bruno's train had long since arrived, but he hadn't come out to her for some reason. She decided to go and meet him. Suddenly, she noticed that the man was hiding behind the bench. Fortunately, he noticed her too. Bruno signaled to her not to reveal them. And a moment later, Carmelita saw the couple that Bruno was eavesdropping on. She immediately put the pieces together. She understood everything. She was even a little pleased that Bruno was already aware of his wife's infidelity, and she was right there as planned. Carmelita decided it would be best for her to hide as well. But Bruno also gestured for her to distract Constantino and Adriana. "Hi!" Carmelita shouted joyfully and ran up to Adriana. The friends hadn't been in touch for 3 years. They hadn't fought, they had simply stopped calling and visiting each other. So, Adriana was genuinely happy to see her old friend. "Where are you going?" Adriana asked. "No, I actually came back," Carmelita lied. "I was on a business trip. I got a new position, so I didn't write to you. I was completely swamped." "And you're here to see Bruno, right?" Adriana was taken aback and blushed. She replied that this time she couldn't visit her husband, so a friend was going instead. "But aren't friends allowed in prison?" Carmelita asked, surprised. She almost let slip that she had also wanted to visit Bruno but wasn't allowed. Fortunately, she managed to stop herself in time. Adriana was even more flustered, but Constantino came to the rescue. He stood up from the bench and, conveniently for Bruno, left his bag on the seat. "I'm going to deliver a package," the man invented on the spot. "I need to give him some very important documents for signing, so I'm going myself. I don't trust the mail." Carmelita noticed that Bruno was pulling out Constantino's wallet, phone, and return ticket, so she continued to distract her friend and lover. Bruno and Constantino had traveled by train many times for work, so Bruno knew that his colleague was very meticulous and, fortunately, consistent in his habits. Each item had its own compartment in the bag, so finding the necessary things wasn't hard for Bruno. All he had to do was hope that Constantino hadn't changed his habits. When Bruno hid behind the bench again, Carmelita said she had to leave. "I want to get to a shower and my own bed after the trip," Carmelita said. "Yes, we need to go too," Constantino replied, grabbing the bag. "The train is arriving." Carmelita quickly moved away from the couple and hid behind a column. She wanted to see what Bruno would do next. Constantino entered the train. The train didn't stay long in their town, so he hurried. Adriana walked along the train until she saw her lover through the window. Bruno was getting closer. He wanted to seize the moment but not reveal himself too soon. As soon as the train started moving, Bruno stood right behind Adriana so Constantino would definitely see him. Carmelita couldn't suppress a malicious smile when she saw the expression on Constantino's face. Adriana didn't understand the horror on Constantino's face at first. She thought something had happened on the train, but then realized that the man was looking directly at her, though slightly higher. She spun around sharply but saw nothing. Bruno had managed to move away and blend into the crowd. Adriana still didn't understand what had happened. The girl took out her phone to call Constantino and find out why he was so scared, but his phone was unavailable. Bruno had immediately thrown it under the train's wheels. Within seconds, a terrible, chilling scream echoed through the station. Several dozen women froze in horror. Even some men couldn't hold back their emotions at what they saw. Adriana hurried to where a crowd of onlookers had gathered. Something told her she needed to go there. Constantino's reaction wasn't without reason. When Constantino saw Bruno, he immediately tried to leave the train. He hadn't expected the train to pick up speed so quickly. In fact, it wasn't going that fast. If he hadn't stumbled and twisted his ankle, he wouldn't have ended up on the tracks. It could have ended with just a scare if it weren't for the penultimate car. Constantino ran all the way to the end, but the train was going faster and faster. He was too scared to jump, so he leaped from the open door of the penultimate car and ended up under the wheels. Adriana fell to her knees and screamed loudly. She overshadowed all other cries. Even Bruno couldn't hold back his tears when he saw the scene. This wasn't how he planned to take revenge. He didn't want his assistant to end up under the wheels of the train. "So what have you achieved with your actions?" Bruno asked Adriana while she was having a meltdown. Hearing her husband's voice, she immediately fell silent. The girl slowly turned around and was horrified to see her husband behind her. She jumped to her feet and attacked him with her fists. Adriana accused Bruno of pushing Constantino. It was his fault. Bruno defended himself and tried to explain that he couldn't have done it because he was on the platform at the time. A few seconds later, the police arrived. Adriana and Bruno were arrested. The crowd was dispersed from the scene, but it wasn't easy. For the curious onlookers, the spectacle was incredibly gripping. It involved both a tragic death and some unclear conflicts. People tried to guess how the trio was connected. The first assumption was, of course, a love triangle. Adriana and Bruno were interrogated for a long time. Initially, the investigation believed Bruno was the culprit. The man was terrified at the thought of ending up back in prison before he had even had a chance to enjoy his freedom. Fortunately for him, there were several dozen witnesses who saw him standing quite far from the scene and talking to an unknown woman. There were also those who noticed that Constantino jumped himself and accidentally fell. Bruno had to explain for a long time how Constantino's return ticket ended up with him. He told everything he could figure out. After listening to Bruno's story, the police officer even felt sympathy for him. "Will you file a complaint against your wife?" "We can charge her with fraudulent actions," the investigator suggested. "I think life has already punished her harshly enough," Bruno replied. "I'll just file for divorce and kick her out of the house." Carmelita cried tears of joy when she saw that Bruno was released. She ran up to him and hugged him tightly. "Let's go home," she quietly asked. "Do you know what happened to Adriana? Was she released?" Bruno asked. Carmelita lowered her eyes. She said that her friend had been taken away by ambulance. They couldn't even question her because she was incoherent. Adriana was screaming and hysterical. She alternated between crying and threatening to throw you under the train. Then she claimed that you weren't even at the station and couldn't have been, Carmelita explained. In short, she lost her mind. I think they took her to a psychiatric hospital. Bruno was upset that things had turned out the way they did. He had planned to give Adriana a hard time, to threaten her with a lawsuit for fraudulent actions. He had even thought of who would help him with this. He also had entirely different plans for Constantino. He thought that the assistant would simply get off at the nearest station and have a hard time getting home without money or a phone. He never imagined that Constantino would decide to jump from the train. The lovers punished themselves. And with such cruelty that Bruno would never have imagined in his thoughts. He blamed himself for it. It was quite hard for him emotionally. But Carmelita tried to comfort him and explain that he wasn't at fault for what had happened. Just think, Constantino wanted to arrange an attack on you, she said. He didn't care at all that you might say goodbye to life. And he jumped only because of his cowardice and stupidity. What was he hoping for? You're right. And Adriana? She went mad, Bruno replied. She went mad the day she thought she could imprison you, take your business, and marry your colleague, Carmelita said. On the very first day of your imprisonment, she told me she wasn't going to wait for you. She wanted to file for divorce, but changed her mind only because you appointed her as your director. Bruno pressed his lips together and tried not to cry. He only asked one question: why hadn't she told him earlier? Because I was protecting your feelings, Carmelita replied. When I took that stack of letters and read them, my first thought was to write a response from Adriana. I didn't want you to suffer. Otherwise, your story would have ended badly too. 2 years after Bruno's release, he divorced Adriana almost immediately. At that time, she was in a psychiatric facility, and Bruno heard nothing about his former wife's fate. He struggled for a long time with his conscience and tried to justify his divorce. He felt it wasn't right to abandon Adriana in such a state, but even the doctors said her condition worsened upon seeing Bruno. Adriana became aggressive. A year ago, Bruno and Carmelita got married. They moved to a different city. Bruno received a lucrative offer to expand the company, and Carmelita didn't mind which city she worked in. With her specialty, she could find work anywhere. The couple agreed from the start not to mix family life with work, not because they didn't trust each other, but to prevent any thoughts that one might deceive the other. Despite their attempts to avoid old memories and trips to their hometown, they sometimes had to return to their roots. Bruno still had a branch there. It was necessary to visit periodically and check on the employees. He had never encountered any old acquaintances before, but during their last trip, he and Carmelita had to confront the past. The couple was already preparing to leave the city when they suddenly noticed a familiar face that was almost unrecognizable. At a small, inconspicuous shop stood a beggar. She swayed strangely back and forth, peering into the faces of passers-by. It was Adriana, and she looked very unwell. Carmelita herself asked Bruno to stop and talk to her former friend. She felt very sorry for Adriana. The girl was dressed like a typical city madwoman, an odd dress with a vest and cardigan over it, hairstyled in 2 pigtails with bows like a little girl, and mismatched sneakers. When Bruno and Carmelita approached Adriana, she didn't immediately recognize them. The girl mumbled to herself. Bruno managed to make out what his ex-wife was saying. I have a lot of money. I'm a businesswoman, Adriana repeated. Hello, Carmelita said cautiously. Arrange meetings with me through my secretary, Adriana responded and walked away in the other direction. When Adriana replied, she straightened her back, lifted her chin proudly, and then hunched over again as she moved a little further away. Bruno and Carmelita exchanged glances and shrugged simultaneously. Suddenly, they heard the shopkeeper calling them. Don't upset her. She's Adriana, our local madwoman, the woman said quietly. She's harmless. She's hospitalized for treatment every 6 months. She's just been released, so she poses no danger. Does she usually pose a danger? Bruno asked in surprise. Only to herself, the shopkeeper sighed heavily. When she has an episode, she goes to the tracks and tries to throw herself under a train. She always does it in the same place, so even the railway workers know about this habit of hers. Whenever it happens, Adriana is sent to the facility. She comes out like this. She pretends to be a wealthy woman, talks about her business and lots of money, but never refuses help. Maybe she needs help? Does she have a house? Carmelita asked. Believe me, she lives well, the shopkeeper reassured the couple. Adriana receives a pension and has an apartment. It seems to have been left by her mother. Moreover, people help her. So she lives like she always dreamed, Bruno joked, but with a very sad tone. Everyone in town knows her, loves her, she has money, and doesn't need to work. Yes, these days I even envy her, the woman laughed. I'd love to forget all my problems and walk around saying I'm the richest. And she genuinely believes it. Is there anyone looking after her? Carmelita asked with concern. The shopkeeper explained that Adriana didn't really need special supervision. However, one of her neighbors occasionally came to the store to take her home. This same neighbor helped her with paying bills, buying groceries, and sometimes even cooked for her. Almost everyone in the neighborhood knew about Adriana. She was not in any danger. Carmelita and Bruno left the store. It wasn't that the shopkeeper's words had greatly reassured them, but they certainly weren't planning to help the former wife and friend. Adriana saw them and straightened her back again, pulling her shoulders back. She asked if they had made an appointment. Carmelita nodded, as she realized it was better to play along with her friend. Now that's different, Adriana said with feigned importance. Bruno got into the car and placed his hands on the steering wheel. He was again troubled by his conscience. He watched his ex-wife's behavior and her appearance. Carmelita remembered how she had once almost driven her friend mad but felt no remorse about it. This just showed that Adriana had already been predisposed to such mental disorders. It's my fault that she went mad, he said quietly. Carmelita sighed and rolled her eyes. She reminded her husband that Adriana was to blame herself. It was no coincidence that her madness was built on her delusions of being wealthy. After all, that was what she had always dreamed of. Even in her right mind, Adriana was ready to do terrible things for money, so she was responsible for her own madness. The tragedy with Constantino just pushed her over the edge, but you are not to blame, Carmelita concluded. Greed and the desire to get everything here and now doomed them. No one knew this, but Adriana had also become a victim of a scammer. Fate had indeed punished her harshly. After Constantino's death, Adriana experienced a mental breakdown. But even that did not drive her insane. It was the encounter with Bruno at the station that marked the point where everything changed in her mind. Adriana was placed in a psychiatric facility, and there was a caretaker whom she mistakenly took for Constantino. The doctor sometimes sent the young man to talk to her and calm her down. After these visits, Adriana improved. She became so detached from reality and mistook the caretaker for her lover that she gave him the password to her account and asked him to withdraw money so Bruno wouldn't get to it. This was the money she had saved during her husband's 5-year imprisonment. The caretaker withdrew the money but decided that giving it to the mentally ill Adriana was pointless. She wouldn't be able to manage it. The caretaker bought Adriana a small apartment on the outskirts, took her there after her release, and then told her he was leaving her. The young man disappeared with the money he had stolen from Adriana. Only a small portion of her savings was used for the apartment. The caretaker moved to another city, and no one looked for him. Adriana completely forgot about her savings. She believed the caretaker when he said he had spent it all on the apartment. Thus, Adriana's pursuit of wealth ended in mental illness. The funds she had so carefully saved were taken by a stranger. She was treated in the same way she had planned to treat her husband. Over time, Adriana stopped perceiving reality altogether. She forgot about all the people from her past. She wouldn't recognize Carmelita, Bruno, or even Constantino if she met him. Bruno started the car, pressed the gas, and swore to himself that he would never return to this city or these memories. He decided to sell this branch and move it closer to him. But he could no longer bear to see these houses and these people. Now Bruno has a new life, a new wife who is expecting a child. There is no need to touch what drags one down, what he no longer wanted to think about. Everyone got what they deserved.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.